I think the other piece is, one way that it was explained to me is that as sociologists, we should be hard on structures and easy on people, which is that I take, my starting point, which it's not always true, but my starting point is the vast number of people, majority of the people I interview are trying to do their absolute best within a system that is deeply dysfunctional. And so the book, if I did it right, hopefully the book will read as if I'm really critiquing the system and doing that with a lot of respect for the people working within it.
Hi, this is Carrie Morrison, and welcome to Episode 3 of Heartforward Conversations from the Heart. Professor Alex Barnard was in LA for 2 weeks in August 2023, and I was able to snag him for an in-person interview to talk about his new book, Conservatorship: Inside California's System of Coercion and Care for Mental Illness. This represents the culmination of 4 years of research and countless interviews, site visits, archive review, and data analysis, which presents the most complete snapshot of our dysfunctional mental health system in California. It will help you make sense of the trauma and tragedy associated with how we compromise on the care and support for the most vulnerable in our communities. I would encourage you to listen to the first interview I conducted with Alex in 2021 when he was in the early stages of this research. You'll find that in Season 2, Episode 2. In that interview, we cover a number of the key definitions and policies associated with the Lanterman-Petris-Short Act, otherwise known as LPS. We also define some of the terms of art associated with a sociologist's view of this issue. Revisiting that episode will help to create the framework to listen to this conversation. Welcome, Alex. It's so great to see you here today in the podcast studio in person. The last time we did this, it was on Zoom in 2021. So great to have you here in person.
It's great to be back, and it's especially great to be in person.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here today. And we're going to talk about this book that you have published. It was a little bit of like a gleam in your eye back in 2021 when you were doing all the research, but it's so exciting that it is now ready. Conservatorship: Inside California's System of Coercion and Care for Mental Illness. And we'll also talk a little bit about what's next in your as a sociologist and as a university professor. I know you can never rest on your laurels with respect to research.
That's true. There definitely is hopefully more coming.
Okay, very good. So this book, which we've been waiting for, and I have read, and it is a page turner because it's so well done through a combination of great documentation and footnotes, but all the compelling stories that you include, which I think is probably unique to how a sociologist would approach this. Can you just share again your reason for tackling this subject and why this has been such a passion for you?
Sure. When we last spoke, I was writing kind of a different book. I had written a dissertation at UC Berkeley that was comparing the public mental health system in France and the United States, and done a lot of research and started writing that. But in 2018, I embarked on a side project because I was living in Berkeley at the time and heard about a bill that was being considered in the legislature that was being pushed by a lot of representatives from San Francisco to expand something called conservatorship to deal with sort of the nexus of addiction, mental illness, and homelessness. And I had barely even heard the term and looked online and searched on Google Scholar and was pretty struck that there was almost no research that had been published recently on what conservatorship actually was. And so I embarked on a bit of a side project trying to just understand what is this program that we're now talking about expanding. And I think over time, it's sort of grew and grew. And I realized that there was a lot of interest in this topic, was only growing. Certainly the Britney Spears case sort of opened up the conversation about conservatorship to a whole new part of the population. And that was really what drove me to decide that this was worth a book-length treatment. And so that's what led me to this.
So that's kind of funny. In 2018, you're just learning about this concept and this aspect of the law. And now I think arguably you're going to become one of the singular experts on this topic in California in 2023. Congratulations.
Thanks. I sort of stand on the shoulders of giants. In the end, this book is thanks to the fact that I interviewed a lot of experts. So.
Very good. Well, so that is something I want to ask you also, because you are a professor of sociology and you make you make some observations at the beginning of the book about your methodology, and you point out that you're not an investigative journalist. You approach this through the lens of sociology, and so therefore that kind of informs how you include people's stories and life experiences and anecdotes. Can you parse that out a bit? What is the unique approach of a sociologist to a topic like this?
Well, I think my fear is that the unique approach of a sociologist is that you add a lot of jargon that sort of obscures things. That's maybe what academics tend to do. I think in this case, one thing that I felt sociology could bring to this is embedding the debates we have about conservatorship into much broader conversations about social policy in the United States and the way that the United States, to a greater extent than other countries, relies on private actors to provide public safety net services, or the extent to which, safety net services in the US are more fragmented and less universal than what you would see in the healthcare system of another country. So I think in some ways that contextualization is really helpful. I think the other piece is, one way that it was explained to me is that as sociologists, we should be hard on structures and easy on people, which is that I take, my starting point, which it's not always true, but my starting point is the vast number of majority of the people I interview are trying to do their absolute best within a system that is deeply dysfunctional. And so the book, if I did it right, hopefully the book will read as if I'm really critiquing the system and doing that with a lot of respect for the people working within it.
I love that. I think that definitely does come through. You talk about almost the super heroic efforts of people who are working at ground level. You call them the street level bureaucrats. That's something I've learned from you. It's a sociological term. And just doing the best they can against odds that seem almost impossible to overcome. And we are going to explore that. So that actually is a perfect segue, because there's a number of things we are not going to talk about today because we covered them in the 2021 interview, which I'm going to call part 1. And that was really kind of sussing out some of those sociological terms. And we're also not going to go back into a detail of what the Lanterman-Petris-Short conservatorship process is, how it is that someone is picked up for danger to self and others, hospitalized, etc. It's going to come up in our conversation, but we are not going to take up precious time to rehash things we've already talked about. Right?
Sounds good.
Okay. So the book is really well laid out and organized to kind of look at all the different elements and players in the system, from crisis intervention to the court system to first responders and locked settings, etc. But I pulled out 5 themes that struck out to me as some of the key observations that you are making about the system that we see playing out in California right now. And the first and most important one is what you describe is abdicated authority, or the way in which the state writ large has abdicated its authority in this very space that impacts people's lives so completely. I guess I am going to renege on what I just said. That is worth you describing again what abdicated authority means, and maybe provide an example or two of how you see that happening.
So I think this concept of abdicated authority emerged from trying to make sense of, I think, 2 seemingly almost impossibly contradictory narratives about what's happening in California. So on one hand, if you talk to a lot of families of people with severe mental illness, but also a lot of clinicians, they'll say it is too hard to conserve somebody in California. We have people who are dying on the streets and we can't get them help. And it's because there are these legal barriers to involuntary treatment and they're just too high. And then on the other hand, you can talk to some legal advocates, but especially people with mental illness themselves who say, actually, I've been facing all sorts of coercion. I've been hospitalized. I've been jailed. So how can these, you could say, well, one of these groups of people is lying or misrepresenting things. But I actually feel that, both of those narratives are in some ways true, and abdicated authority is trying to make sense of that. So abdicated authority is saying we exercise a lot of power over people with mental illness. People living with mental illness, they can be placed in a hospital. They can be placed in a conservatorship. They are getting jailed and incarcerated. But no one is really exercising authority over the system that is doing that. So there's no sort of there's no plan, there's no oversight, there's no accountability in a serious way to make sure that that exercise of force, sometimes coercion over people with mental illness is actually leading anywhere. And I think there's so many stories that I heard in the book of kind of repeated aimless coercion, psychiatric hold after psychiatric hold that just didn't lead anywhere. And so that's where you see these contradictory truths sort of coming together, which is, it is true that, that person is not getting sort of sustained help, maybe as their family member wanted. But it's also true that from that person's perspective, they're not living in sort of a paradise of civil liberties. They're actually having their rights restricted all the time. And abdicated authority is trying to capture the way that sort of the sort of withdrawal of the state, the sort of abdication of responsibility by government for the use of its own power has created this sort of paradoxical tragedy.
Yeah, I pulled one of the quotes because you do return to this theme over and over again, and I think you make a really compelling case. You say that because of abdicated authority, in so doing, the state government, avoids the cost and the difficult choices that the accountable exercise of that power entails. Accountability is something that also comes up over and over, as it's hard to pin accountability on who, right? You also pointed out that as you talk to a lot of people who actually function as a public guardian or as a conservator in different counties in California, and one of the public guardians you talked to in Northern California said, quote, "You can look around 58 counties and we're all going to tell you something different." So what is it about California's system that has disaggregated control to the counties? And we disbanded our State Department of Mental Health back, 2011 or so. How does that contribute to abdicated authority?
Well, I think there are political reasons that mental health services have been sort of kicked down to the county level. It's related to budget crises in the 1990s, right? But I think there's an underlying logic to it, which is, on one hand, I think the people who are in favor of local control say, county government is going to do the best job of knowing what people in that county need. But in practice, what we've created is a system where essentially your civil liberties vary based on your zip code or where you sit on the county line. That some counties have a very well-funded public guardian's office, and that means that they're a little bit more expansive in terms of how they're applying conservatorship, for better or for worse. Some counties have really invested a lot in alternatives to conservatorship. Other counties are putting all of their sort of funding stream that's available into 24-hour locked settings. And again, like, variation has value. It allows for experimentation. So if we had kind of if we had a little bit more accountability in research and evaluation, we could really say, okay, which county system of conservatorship is working better and how could we scale that up and teach other counties how to do that. But I think, in practice, we sort of have 58, very different systems that are interpreting the law around conservatorship, which is ultimately pretty vague and pretty general. They're interpreting it based on local resource constraints and sort of local preferences in some ways for how they want to sort of organize mental health services.
Yeah, and I think you made the point that this is a state mandated function for which there is no flow through of state resources. So they're cobbling together at the best of their ability within whatever the county is providing to make these decisions on behalf of people.
And I think the absurdity of it is we've been having this conversation now really intensely since 2017, 2018 about expanding conservatorship. And yet every year the county public guardians have come to the state asking for dedicated funding. These are the people who would actually be doing the conserving if conservatorship was expanded. And the state has said no to that. So I think, that again captures this sort of exercise of power without responsibility, that we're going to say we're going to conserve more people, but we're not actually going to resource those departments in a way that would make sure that the public guardians are actually meeting people's needs, are regularly seeing their clients, that they have time to investigate the settings they're placing people in and making sure they're offering quality care. I think, you can see that paradox right there.
Another observation that jumped out at me that I think you make a very good case for in all your examples is that in California, the way our system has evolved, there is really no option for long-term care that actually would contribute to someone's ability to truly get stabilized or even start on a recovery journey. We see evidence of people being released too soon from the hospital. If they're in on a 5150, they could be back out a couple hours later with their hospital band on, and they were not kept even for 72 hours. So what is what did you notice about that pattern throughout the state of California?
Well, I at risk of sounding sort of wishy-washy, I think it's a little bit trickier than that, because on one hand, we do have these cases of people being kicked out in hospital slippers and with a, hospital wristband with no resources, and then they're back in the hospital a few days later. But if you go into these county, particularly the public hospitals, they'll tell you that 75% of their beds are taken up by people who don't belong in a hospital, but are waiting for a more appropriate placement. So, everywhere in the system, people are not getting what they need because of some sort of, kind of a lack of real organization, coordination, and strategy to make sure that people are winding up where they need to go. So I think it's not just, there are long-term locked settings. We call them IMDs, Institute for Mental Diseases. We have board and care homes, which are, you've covered them a lot in the podcast. So, but they're unlocked congregate living settings. I think that part of the problem is that there isn't a lot of really high quality options that will allow people to recover and step down and liberate those places for new people who might need them.
Yeah, so you talk about, you mentioned a sociologist, Neil Gong. This is a pretty compelling quote. He said, when people land in a board and care, people become lumps. His lumps, people from whom little progress is expected and to whom little service is provided. So it's almost like the lowest common denominator of service, whether it's in an emergency room, in an acute setting, or even in a community setting. We have not really agreed to invest in transforming someone from a lump into actually a contributing member of our society.
Right. And I think accepting that people can have a chronic illness that might mean that they have moments where they're doing worse, where they backslide, however you want to define that. But that's not a reason to stop trying to invest in them and move them towards recovery, however that person is defining it. I think some of the most hopeful moments the places I visited in my book that I felt, most hopeful were kind of enriched residential services where it might not be a locked setting. Some people might be conserved, other people are not conserved, but actually conservatorship becomes almost irrelevant because there's so much focus on figuring out a way to engage that person in a program by figuring out what they need and what their goals are. And that requires, sustained engagement. That requires a program that isn't super time limited. Well, it still, retains some kind of commitment towards, moving somebody along towards something better, something different.
Focusing on the actual person as opposed to whatever the institutional constraints might be.
Right.
From what I could tell, there were three organizations or entities that you felt, despite our system, are able to kind of rise above it and provide that kind of level of care. One is Synergy in Morgan Hill. Another one is California Psychiatric Transitions, which I've heard about, and I believe that's an IMD setup. And then the Progress Foundation in San Francisco. Do you want to give a shout out to each of them and just briefly about what it is that they're able to do that's so unique?
So I have not visited CPT. So I have heard from families in particular really positive things about it. It is a locked IMD that is known for taking individuals who other providers might refuse. They might say this person has failed out of too many programs. We think that they look like too much of a risk on paper. But so I don't know a lot about that program. I visited Synergy. I think, we forget that sort of the aesthetics of where people are matters. The old state hospitals are, some of my research in France, they were really, really problematic places, but I've always found it striking that, in the early 19th century, we thought that people with mental illness needed a place that was beautiful. Like they should be in a place with grounds and buildings that were architecturally appealing, and that would somehow play into their recovery. And so I think, the fact that some of these programs are located, Progress Foundation is located in the Mission in kind of a very classic San Francisco style house. I think those things matter. I think, I think places where residents are really engaged and active. I think when I interviewed people who have been through conservatorship and have had, something that they see as a positive outcome coming out of that, it's the fact that they were given meaningful activities. Even if it means, running groups within that program or having an opportunity to cook. I think one of the sad things about board and care homes is actually by licensing, their residents are not really allowed to participate in meals. And that's such a, fundamental part of collective life. That's such an important part of social life. And so I think the kind of programs that are involving those residents in their sort of the daily life of the program, I think those are really exciting things to see. And I think also, for these kind of visions to work, you have to be willing to take a chance on people. You have to, again, take somebody who might seem behaviorally dysregulated in sort of clinical speech and believe that if you treat that person as a person and you see them and you meet them where they're at, that person doesn't actually necessarily have to be removed and sent to a hospital. I think those are the really hopeful elements that I saw.
Yeah, I found
programs.
hope in your descriptions of those as well. And I mean, I had Tom Insel here in this same studio, I think last year, and he talks about people, place, and purpose now. He wrote a book, Healing, former head of the National Institute for Mental Health. So people, that need for socialization and connections, avoiding loneliness. Place, that the environment does matter. People obviously need housing, but they also need housing that is hospitable. And then purpose, the ability to help make lunch, and I have visited Synergy also and contrast it with a board and care I just visited a few weeks ago here in Los Angeles, where the day room, all the furniture was pushed up against the edge that had the antiseptic smell of some kind of bleach-infused floor cleaner. The TV was set to one channel 2, and compared to Synergy, where their day room is leather couches with a screen on, a full screen TV on the wall, plants, carpet, and the environment is radically different. So there is this kind of shift from the institutional feel that too many places default to something that is more human scale. And yeah, you hint at that throughout the book, that we see glimmers of hope where that is really embraced.
And I think, both of us have an interest in models from outside of the US, Italy or France. But in the kind of last chapter of the book, where I lay out what would a vision for a system that actually reduces the need for and use of coercion look like, I really focused on things that exist in California already, but that aren't systematic, that haven't been scaled up, that haven't had that kind of state level support. And sort of another place to give a shout out to, or where I found a lot of hope, was the California Clubhouse up in San Mateo County. And I think the Clubhouse model is so important because it goes beyond Synergy or Progress, because it's actually a space that is run by people with lived experience of mental illness themselves. And I remember when I visited, they talked about all these things to make the clubhouse operate, whether it's a little store within the clubhouse, whether it's putting out the newsletter. Sort of somebody said, well, what does a newsletter really matter? And they said, well, newsletter is about human dignity. It's about feeling some sense of purpose. Clubhouses have a big focus on employment. But it's then I talked to people at the clubhouse who said, I don't want to be employed. I don't need to be employed. I don't like the way I'm treated in the community, but I need purpose. I need an activity. I need something that gives my life meaning. And I think it's really exciting that people are talking about expanding that model across California.
We are definitely going to get a clubhouse in Los Angeles. It's in the works for next year. So another observation that comes through loud and clear is just the absolute lack of data in this space. I mean, you certainly noticed it in 2018 when you started to even begin to look at this issue. But I found it fascinating. You mentioned in your book, just quote, there is no statewide reporting on, or in most cases, countywide data. We're talking about the conservatorship kind of continuum. We don't even know the most basic outlines of what happens to conservatees, where they are, how long they stay there, what services they are receiving from their conservators, and perhaps most important, whether those conservatees are actually satisfied with any of the above. What contributes to this dearth of data?
I think the fact that it's an invisible population that's, very easy to lose track of because, they're often not able to advocate for themselves and have often lacked advocates who are going to insist on accountability for what happens to them. But I think it's obviously, a bit standard for an academic to talk about we need more data and we need more research. But I think it's difficult to overstate how problematic it is that we're having these debates in the absence of data about how the system is currently functioning. I want to just give one quick kind of shocking example of this. In 2019, the San Francisco government released an audit of its own conservatorship system. And based on the number that San Francisco reported to the state of the number of conservatorships, they said, we have one of the lowest rates of conservatorships in California. They revisited it 3 years later and looked at and simply asked their own public conservator's office, how many people do you have conserved? And it turns out that they had the highest rate of conservatorships in California, and it's 3 times as high as in LA and something like 8 or 9 times as high in San Diego. That paints 2 really different stories of what's happening in San Francisco. The first story was, well, why aren't we conserving anyone? And the second story is, why is conservatorship not getting us where we want to go if we're conserving more people than other counties? So I think, the most basic piece of accountability is a count. It's actually knowing how many people are in this system. But, beyond that, we really need outcome data. And that should include, people's own experiences of conservatorship. And again, because that would allow us to figure out which counties are actually doing a better job of this. I think that very few people know that Fresno County, for example, has a really innovative approach to conservatorship that is different from most other counties. And it would be great to have, to be able to have reliable data that allows us to compare, does their model, which is really recovery focused, which is really trying to use person-centered language and reduce, a focus on sort of compliance, what kind of outcomes is that model producing and how does that do compared to, other counties? I would really love to know the answer to that.
And again, without a state Department of Mental Health anymore, there is no particular entity who would even be incentivized or motivated to capture that on a statewide basis. So how do other counties learn from Fresno if there's no real mechanism to bring them all together? Right,
absolutely. And the state publishes a yearly report on involuntary treatment, Lanterman-Petris-Short, the 5150, 72 hours, 5250, 14 days conservatorships. But the data is incredibly bad. I can look at one of those reports and immediately tell you where there's just a typo in Excel that just is totally off. And I think it is shocking that we're talking about $100 billion agency. We don't have, somebody even just making sure that those reports are remotely credible. And I understand, like all these institutions, people are working with various kinds of constraints. The state can only work with the data that the counties give them. But all of this always poses the question of, okay, who's responsible for fixing this?
Yeah, and you raise the point, and whose responsibility is it to ask the question? So the very, very people who are kind of caught up in the system don't have a particular advocacy voice themselves. Families and parents are often marginalized, and so, I think your book is going to do a great service of just asking so many fundamental questions that we cannot answer. And it's kind of crazy that we're at 2023 and this is finally really coming to light. Another observation that you share, which is really important, is how, this is what I think contributes to our crisis of homelessness, is that we talk a lot about housing and affordable housing and supportive housing, et cetera. But what we haven't really factored into the overall equation of where beds are located is that we are continuing to lose beds at every step of the psychiatric treatment continuum, from emergency rooms to hospital beds to IMDs, Institute for Mental Disease, step-down board and care beds. You had a pretty shocking statistic that relative to our population, California only had 58% of the acute care psychiatric beds in 2019 than it had in 1995. So what are some of the forces, market and otherwise, that are contributing to a lack of investment in these critical beds?
Well, I think you sort of already sort of mentioned that when we have a public safety net that is heavily privatized, it does wind up being market forces that shape the availability of care. So that decline in acute care hospital beds, there's a big boom in private psychiatric hospitals in the 1980s. We hear about the closure of state hospitals. We actually don't hear very often the fact that there was actually a huge expansion in private psychiatric hospitals. And in the 1990s, there was a huge crackdown on those hospitals from insurance as there was a shift towards managed care. And as a result, a lot of those psychiatric units, which were very profitable in the 1980s, all of a sudden became very unprofitable. And so they closed. But all of this was happening really without any, rational planning about, okay, how many acute psychiatric beds do you actually need in a well-functioning mental health system? Similarly with board and cares, in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of people left state hospitals with no serious provision for what their long-term care needs would actually be. So we set up clinics. There were maybe places to get medication, but where is that person actually going to live? There wasn't a lot of planning that went into that. In some ways, fortunately for the state of California, private entrepreneurs sort of stepped up to fill that gap, largely financed through federal Social Security disability payments. But again, that sort of non-system is collapsing because of the cost of operating these facilities has just vastly outstripped those disability payments. So there's a way in which the system has sort of risen and fallen based on programs that are sort of the state has almost entirely washed its hands of any role in actually regulating and planning for that.
So you also mentioned I don't really understand the Medicaid reimbursement system very well. I know you've had to school yourself on it, that we hear these stories about how someone who has been hospitalized, they're just beginning to turn the corner on maybe stabilization. Medication is actually working. It's, their nutrition is kicking in, et cetera. And then they're released far too early for really any kind of hope for recovery. And as I think you describe in the book, that there's a shift at the hospital that they're no longer going to be reimbursed at quite the rate that the person needed higher level of services when they first came in, and so it becomes an administrative burden to keep them longer. Can you describe how that works?
Sure. For somebody who's on Medi-Cal, which is public insurance, kind of it would be called Medicaid at the federal level, it's the county mental health department that is going to pay for that hospitalization. When somebody meets medical necessity criteria for a hospitalization, which is very, very strict, it's really pretty close to those criteria of danger to self, danger to others, the hospital is going to be paid a full rate, and that varies around the state, but it could be something like $1,200 a day if you're in Northern California. At some point, the county is going to say this person is stabilized enough that they are no longer meet that medical necessity criterion. But the hospital can't necessarily discharge that person because maybe this person is stabilized for one day and the hospital thinks that person should go to an IMD for long-term step-down care. But the IMD says, well, we're not going to take someone until they've been stable for a couple of weeks, right? We don't want to take that risk. And so in that interim time, the payment to the hospital drops substantially. I believe the administrative rate is something like $600 a day. So that's a really big disparity. And so that person represents kind of a financial loss for the hospital versus somebody who's more acute and came back. But the same patient coming back 10 times for a 6-day stay is actually, the hospital's reimbursed much more for that than a single 60-day stay. I'm not saying that the hospitals are trying to do that or soliciting that, but the reality is the incentives are in favor of cycling people through the system really rapidly. But this gets back to this question of how many beds do we need? Maybe we don't, there's been a lot of questions about that because if you look at LA County hospitals or San Francisco General, again, 75 or 80% of the days that are billed for are administrative days, which is to say most of the people in the hospital at any point in time are people who have been cleared to go somewhere else, but they haven't found a placement for them.
And so it's that just the logjam kind of continues as we get people stuck at these different transition points.
Right, absolutely.
You've made that case really clear. And I will tell you that there's a particular person who's been in my life for quite some time who I feel like I learned everything about the mental health system through his life. And he was in a locked hospital last year and was suddenly released to the street, nowhere near Hollywood. He had no cell phone. He had no money. And somehow he must have talked his way onto a bus to get back to Hollywood. But when I tried to call as an advocate, couldn't talk to anybody who would give me a reason as to why they would let him out the door. So this is a contemporaneous problem. Yeah.
Right. And this is where you have to talk about structures rather than people. I mean, I think a lot of inpatient clinicians are really, really frustrated about the way that insurance is calling them after 24 hours saying you have to get this person out, that sometimes hospital management is throwing a pizza party for the unit with the shortest length of stay. So, people are operating within really tight constraints, and that includes the acute care hospitals.
So what really makes your book very readable, because it is densely packed with great information and thoroughly documented, is the little vignettes and the stories that you provide, most of which are anonymous, like you're not attributing it to the person's specific name. But I'm just wondering, what would be one of the stories that really kind of hit you as being emblematic of the scale of this problem that you might be willing to share?
Sure. I'm going to tell you the story of Joyce and Joe, and those are pseudonyms. And I think it's in some ways a very unsatisfying story because it can be read in different ways. And I think different people will hear different things, but I think that captures some of the really fundamental ambiguities of the system. So, like a lot of people, Joe started to experience symptoms of schizophrenia in adolescence. His mother, Joyce, worked really hard to get him into treatment. This was back in the 1970s. He went to a trial of new kind of medication in the state hospitals. He was through IMDs. He went through board and cares. And just for years and years was cycling out of these different settings. And he was on conservatorship, right? But conservatorship is not this panacea if there isn't, good quality care to back it up. In the 1990s, and she describes, going to settings like an IMD and, being ready to leave her son there and just getting to the parking lot and realizing, I can't do this. I can't leave my son in this kind of a setting. And like a lot of parents, it was just this there was a lot of heroics in this. She went back to school to become a nurse and, got involved in her local mental health board, trying to do everything to find some sort of solution for her son. Eventually, her advocacy got her son placed on Clozaril, which is an antipsychotic that, like a lot of things in this system, can have, really difficult side effects. It requires blood draws because of potentially, very dangerous medical complications. But for a lot of people is the medication that has, allowed them to stabilize. And since the 1990s, since he got on Clozaril, this is somebody who has gotten off the cycle. He's gotten off of, going in and out of acute care hospitals and IMDs and locked settings like that. And he's been living in a kind of therapeutic residential community since then. And it's one of these residential communities where the goal is to step people down and send them into supported housing. And he hasn't done that, right? And you can say maybe the system isn't trying hard enough. You can say maybe, some people, this illness makes it really hard for them to live independently. Maybe that would have worked had he gotten the right treatment in the 1970s, but after, 20 years of cycling in and out, that just was no longer a possibility. And like, a lot of people with mental illness in the state, Joe is aging. And, again, the combination of his history and treatment and the medications he's taking made him very frail. And so eventually he fell and got sent to a nursing home. And essentially his public guardian told Joyce, you're getting old, you can't take care of him. And so this is where, your son is going to live for the rest of his life. And, Joyce, I believe she's 89, still an incredible advocate, but she told me, I have no faith that there's going to be anything for my son when I'm gone. And here's somebody, on which millions of dollars have been spent on care. And yet all of these interventions, nothing can give this mom faith that her son is going to be well taken care of.
I think that's one of the most, in talking to any parent of an adult child with a mental illness, that is one of the scariest things to think about, is what happens to their adult children when they're no longer here. Yeah. Oh my gosh. The book was feeling kind of heavy to me for the most part. It's heavy because you are actually documenting the reasons for everything that we are observing. And the fragmentation in our system is so pervasive that it's hard to really see how Humpty Dumpty could be put back together again, basically. But I will move, let's talk about some of the things that you do suggest in the final chapters. And again, this interview cannot even begin to do justice to the significance of just spending time with this book, because there's so much there. But we started this conversation like you were defining what is abdicated authority, what does that look like, how have we gotten here? And you do talk about the fact that we need to move back towards something that might look more like engaged authority. This is not working, this abdicated authority. So you have 4 different ideas. One is, I'll share what you say and you can kind of riff on this a little bit. One is to actually work to create a mental health system that is organized as an entitlement. And you kind of use the developmental disability system as a model. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Sure. And I should start by saying, if you talk to people in the developmental disability system, they will immediately tell you about all of the problems that system has. And then they will say, but it's so much better than our public mental health system. And I think, and it's in some ways the same thing I saw when I was doing research in France. It's a system with a lot of problems and flaws, but the basic architecture, the basic idea behind it makes a lot more sense. And that idea is of an entitlement, that people who meet a certain set of criteria, the state then assumes the responsibility of creating a kind of individualized service plan and going out and contracting for and identifying those services. And that's really different than a system that starts with, here's a pot of funding to the county, and sort of come up with sort of the mix that makes sense to, maybe not make sense for the people of the county, but makes sense to a county supervisor, or makes sense given the history. I mean, who knows why this county ends up with this program and another county ends up with something else. And then, and I think the sort of most disturbing or the most problematic part of our public mental health system is that it is funded, and it is in statute, it says it is funded to the extent that resources are available. And that sort of out is not available in the developmental disabilities system, that the state has, at least in theory, made a commitment to spend what is necessary to meet the needs of the people in that system. And that's, what healthcare systems look like in countries with universal healthcare all around the world. This is not at all a pie in the sky idea.
Yeah, excellent. And I always like to point out that my first job out of college was at a regional center for the developmentally disabled citizens. So it's coming full circle, understanding how different that system is. The second suggestion you posit is that we need to incentivize persistent care that addresses the social as well as the medical needs of people. You started to kind of touch upon that, about the need for purpose and the ability to contribute to making dinner and things that are non-institutional, non-clinical. So talk a little bit more about that idea.
Well, I think this is something where kind of both sides of this very acrimonious, very dug-in conservatorship debate need to potentially give a little ground. I think on one hand, advocates for expanding conservatorship need to recognize that a lot of forced interventions just don't work, and they can drive people away, and they don't necessarily stick. You can put somebody in a hospital, but then, they're going to want to get as far away from the system as possible. I think on the other hand, I think sometimes we have a vision of what voluntary services look like that is not really in keeping with what we know about human nature, which is, I've seen through some of my observations that often, kind of public outpatient services in California, if the person says no, get lost 2 or 3 times, you close out their file. And if they ever reappear, it's a whole process to reevaluate them, reopen their file. And I think we actually need, for individuals who've been burned by the system, who feel really, disconnected from it, have felt it hasn't met their needs, but for whom, for whatever reason, we as a society feel we can't leave them alone. You need something where you're not forcing somebody to say yes, but you're maybe not taking that first no as a final no, right? You're being persistent. And I think that kind of persistence often, shouldn't necessarily, like a lot of people, maybe they need medication would help them, but it's a pretty bad opening offer as far as I can tell. Whereas, hey, let me help you get an ID, let me help you get housing, let me take you to, primary care, dentist appointment that you haven't had access to. I think that's often, where engagement is really going to start. So I think that, and there's a lot of complexities about why that's not happening. And some of it's related to our payment system that's based on minute by minute billing. You have to show how, what you're doing kind of fits within sort of narrow medical boxes. And I think it'd be, I'm not an expert in sort of payment reform, but I think something where, clinical teams are given, kind of a budget, but then encouraged to really use that however you think is most effective. And here's the metrics we want to see. I think that's probably the way forward.
Yeah. In Italy, they talk about relentless negotiation. That's the word when you get that first no. Okay, well, let's keep talking.
Yeah.
Find another, maybe tomorrow it'll be different. Yeah. A third observation you make for the future is that we need to construct, and I so agree with this, a full continuum of residential treatment that meets needs at disparate points in a person's life. And you talk about the fact that if we try to assume that one size fits all is going to work, this fails us. Some people need more structure, less structure, and that can change. What would it take for us to move in that direction?
Well, I think the good news is that there are, really serious investments being made in California. The governor has a lot of initiatives that are about shoring up board care, that is about building residential treatment. And, I think really important investments in housing. At the end of the day, if there isn't housing waiting for somebody at the end of all of these interventions, you're just not going to get very far. So it is really important that we, embed solutions to the mental health crisis in a broader approach to the housing crisis. I think that, one thing that has been lost is, I think that there's no level of, or most levels of care, you should not have to be on a conservatorship to access them. So right now, for those sort of higher level, structured levels of care, you often have to enter them involuntarily. And I think that sort of really distorts the system, because then you don't have to really pose the question of what would it take to make this 12-month residential substance use program something people would actually want to go into. That's really, for that to work, people have to really want to engage in it. So, and that's why I think places like Synergy or Progress Foundation are so interesting, because they are sort of asking that question of, we're asking people to do something really, really hard. And we could, people could be mandated into that, but what would it take to actually have that person want to participate in it?
Yeah, voluntarily. Very good. And then finally, the fourth observation you make is that we need to switch our view of conservatorship to an evidence-based targeted intervention. And how would we move from this kind of fragmented, every county does what it wants to do, into actually evidence-based intervention?
Well, I think we need, again, to put metrics and evaluation in place and to really look at the different models that are being piloted around the state. San Francisco has a community, and Alameda County have a community conservatorship model that is sort of the underlying idea is, well, maybe some people need to be on conservatorship. They need that sort of, support with medication compliance, but they don't need to be in a locked facility. Maybe they could actually be in independent housing. In LA right now, there's an experiment with outpatient conservatorship, which is the idea that maybe some people could go onto conservatorship, but without passing through an acute care hospitalization that might be traumatic and unhelpful given what their needs are. I talked already about the RISE program in Fresno that's pairing public guardians with clinicians and really moving towards a more recovery focused approach. So I think really rigorously evaluating those and seeing, how effective are they relative to sort of the standard LPS conservatorship program. I think that'd be really crucial. In terms of changing conservatorship towards an evidence-based program, I think we also need to be asking really critically some of these populations that some policymakers are proposing to expand conservatorship to, what is our evidence that it will actually work for them? So yes, there are a lot of people who are struggling with substance use, with meth, and we think that they need something, right? But what makes us think that conservatorship is actually the right solution to that? Right now, we really don't have a lot of evidence of that. What makes us think that conservatorship is the right tool for addressing individuals where, the reason they're being put into the system is actually sort of commission of crimes, often, related to mental illness, related to substance use. So I think we have to think about, why is it we think these interventions will work for some of these populations we're currently, pushing into the conservatorship system without a lot of sense of, again, like why we think that would actually, help meet those people's
Well said.
needs.
And I think from the lens of a researcher, you ask those questions. That's exactly the framework. One last thing before we wrap up here. You and I, you have participated sometimes on Zoom, and I've been a member of a group called the Grave Disability Task Force for many years, looking to possibly tighten up the definition of what is grave disability, which actually is a precursor to actually being granted a conservatorship. But I think you've made the case in your book over and over again. I'm just going to use one quote here. Grave disability is a slippery standard that expands to fill inpatient beds when they are available and shrinks to justify emptying them when they're not. So it's the definition in and of itself is not going to solve any issues because it's linked all the way back to what we've been talking about for the past 30 minutes or so, just the lack of treatment that is meaningful and can sustain a person's recovery. So any final thoughts on the topic of defining grave disability in a different way based on your research?
Yeah, so right now before the California legislature, there's SB43, which is one of a series, every year since 2017, there's been, bills proposed to, rewrite, but particularly expand what counts as gravely disabled. It's currently somebody who can't meet their basic need for food, clothing, or shelter as a result of a mental disorder. And the current proposal, SB43, is to expand that to include personal safety. I'm not sure if that's the exact term that's used, or medical care. I think in reality, when resources are available, and also to include people with a substance use disorder, I think in reality, when resources are available, clinicians, judges, public guardians are already using conservatorship in some of those cases because it's a little bit common sense, actually. Like, why would you let somebody die because they're not providing for their needs for clothing, but you would conserve that person, but you wouldn't conserve somebody who's not meeting their need for, taking care of, an infection
wound.
Or something like that. Right. So I think in practice, there's already a lot of workarounds. So, maybe updating the law in some ways, it makes sense. Maybe it will put pressure on various parts of the system to not sort of hide behind the law as a reason for sort of declining to support or care for, certain individuals in certain kinds of situations. But I think that, what we've seen over and over again in California is, just changing the law doesn't make it so, right? Like, there needs to be implementation, there needs to be leadership. I mean, even the LPS Act itself in 1967, the intention was to end, indefinite, inappropriate commitment of people with an involuntary commitment of people with mental illness. And, that itself didn't happen, partly because the system, the LPS was predicated on, this system of community care, was never really built up in the way that was promised. So, the California's sort of history is littered with, legislative reform that were never really backed up.
With the actual ability to implement it. Yes, you're right. Excellent point. The book is exciting. I hope people are going to run out and get it. I'm curious, it's been a big effort for you for the past 3 or 4 years researching this. What do you hope will be accomplished with the publication of this book?
Well, I don't want to stray into a sort of a megamaniacal vision that this book alone is going to, really move the needle on this debate. What I hoped I would do in writing it is do justice to the complexity of the issue and do justice with all the people who shared their experiences, their expertise, in some cases, their traumas with me. So, in some ways, what I hope is that the people who informed it, the people who read it, find that it is true to their experiences. I think after that, I would hope that this book would be a resource for policymakers or advocates who want to really start thinking about what are the real solutions here beyond simply, ramping up. I think on one hand, simply ramping up involuntary treatment without thinking about these other issues we've talked about, but also recognizing that just sort of funding more services without thinking about how we're going to make sure those services are reaching the people who most need it, that itself is also not sufficient. I think everyone agrees more funding would be great, but I don't think more funding alone is the solution. So, I hope that the book is a resource. I hope it points in some interesting directions. After that, as sociologists, I don't think we're experts in policy design ourselves. So I'm hoping, some folks will use it as a launching off point to get into some of the details of how we would actually, build a system that where the state, again, stops abdicating its authority for the use of its own power, for care for some of the most vulnerable citizens, and is really engaged in supporting those people.
And since this book is now behind you, and I know you're an ever curious person, and you've been back out in LA beginning to think about your next project, what is calling you now in terms of your next round of research? And people who may want to reach out to you because they have ideas or thoughts, what's on the horizon next for you?
Well, in some ways, it's going back to what I said I was going to do 2 years ago and what I'm still supposed to do, which is write up this book comparing mental health services in the US and France and trying to understand, what are the consequences of the very different choices these two mental health systems made in the 1960s about how to deinstitutionalize. As part of that, I've come back to California because I'm, one of the pieces that I touch on in the book but haven't fully delved into is the intersection of the mental health system and the criminal justice system. And I've been particularly interested in the Office of Diversion and Reentry in Los Angeles because it feels to me like it is actually a really serious effort that is pushing the needle and thinking about what would it really take to get people with mental illnesses out of incarceration and support them. ODR, for example, is promising people lifetime housing and a lifetime case manager. That's something that exists almost nowhere else, not just in the mental health system in California, but almost in the welfare system of the US. There's there are very few places where you see that kind of commitment. So I think probably as I delve into it, you start to see the contradictions and the flaws, but I also think you have to believe in something. And I'm really excited about some of the things that are happening around criminal justice diversion in LA and excited to put it in dialogue with some of the things I learned about how they manage the relationship between the mental health system and the criminal justice system in France. So that's the immediate next project. And after that, who knows? Who knows?
Well, I think we are very grateful that though you are based at NYU, you have made California your laboratory because you are really going to help us kind of tease out what has been actually happening and how challenging this is. And you have given us a roadmap for some good policy discussion moving forward. And I just want to congratulate you again on this book. It's a big accomplishment. We're excited to be able to be a mouthpiece to let people know about it. And I look forward to continuing a conversation maybe in a year or so about where the next phase of your research takes you.
Well, you've been supporting this project from very early on, so I'm really grateful for that and for the chance to talk to you about it again.
Very good. Thanks, Alex. Have a wonderful day.
Take care.
If you truly care about standing up for bold system change in California, I have one practical recommendation for you. In addition to buying this book for yourself, I would purchase one additional one for you to hand deliver to a policymaker that you think will still be in this game for the next 5 or 10 years. This is a marathon, not a sprint. This terribly fragmented system will not be easily fixed. It will require advocacy, coalition building, and fearless legislative leaders willing to speak truth and fight for the changes to serve the very people we have abandoned in our society. I will note that this interview occurred prior to the passage of S4E3, which is referred to in this conversation. I will include information about that new law in the episode notes. Our next episode will feature an interview with a team of researchers who have spent the last year researching the industry casually referred to as our board and care system in LA County. This represents a housing resource that is, for the most part, invisible to HUD, our city and county housing officials, and the general public. Yet it represents home for thousands upon thousands of arguably the most vulnerable neighbors in our communities. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support of Heartforward LA. And thank you to my technical support here at Verdugo Sound, Aaron Stern. See you next time.